We might think of civic virtues as roughly excellences within a community or a society that enable it to flourish by contributing to something that we call the common good. When civic virtues are lacking, sometimes civil rights legislation is often used to protect individuals within that society from harm, oppression, marginalization, discrimination. Most of us, especially those of us that have been here for the last few days, are familiar with much of our country's history of racial civil rights. One of the things that's fascinated me over the last 2 days is as I've been looking at timelines, to think about the timelines that we've encountered over the last few days match up to the timelines about disability advocacy that I know about. And so last night I kept adding in little bits of this talk to try to make connections. So does anybody remember when the Civil Rights Act was passed? 1964. In 1888, the city of Chicago, right, northern city, passed what is probably the best known ugly law in the United States, which says the following: any person who is diseased, maimed, mutilated, or in any way deformed so as to be an unsightly or disgusting object, or an improper person, right? We'll let you be an object or an improper person. Right? Those are your two choices. To be allowed in or on the streets, highways, thoroughfares, or public places of the city shall not therein or thereon expose himself to public view under the penalty of a fine. Passed, I think, in 1888. Civil Rights Act passed 1964. Any idea when this law might have gone off the books in Chicago? 1974. And the last person, according to Susan Schweik, whose book this part draws on, says that the last person arrested in the United States for being visibly disabled in public was in Omaha, Nebraska in 1974. Interesting to think about. Today, I'll be talking about much of the history of the U.S. disability rights movement, particularly with an eye towards the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, for reasons that I think will become clear as I go. Initially passed in 1990 and heralded as the extension of civil rights protections to disabled people. I'm going to be especially interested in how religious organizations lobbied and succeeded to be exempt from the ADA, and how this exemption enables any religious organization to this day to legally discriminate on the basis of disability in almost every context. The final section of the talk will examine how a number of civic virtues can help us push back against the disability discrimination that is still legal in the name of religious freedom. And throughout, I'm primarily interested not just in personal attitudes or prejudices. I mean, those things matter too. But I'm interested primarily in political opportunities and protections. Though, of course, the former, people's individual biases and attitudes, often shape the political opportunities that people have. Structural problems like discrimination and oppression need structural and not just individualistic kinds of responses. So that's the reason for the focus on legal and procedural issues. So that's my goal for the next 40 minutes. Where did Aaron go? What time am I supposed to stop? 45? Okay, I just want to pace myself, especially since I added in a bunch of stuff. The first part of this talk will then be on the disability rights movements as a locus for civil rights, primarily in terms of the push for the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA. It'd be really interesting to talk about what the push for disability rights looks like in other countries, but I'm not going to do that today. But before I start that history, two qualifications. The first is that the ADA is not the only significant civil rights legislation aimed at disability protections, even here in the United States. There's also, for instance, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. It was initially passed in 1974 as the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. When it was passed in 1974, 60% of states did not offer public education opportunities for disabled students. maybe there's a need for the law. There's the 1982 United Nations World Program of Action Concerning Disabled People, which approaches disability not from a civil rights perspective, but a human rights perspective. And the UN Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, passed by the UN in 2006, which has as its purpose, quote, to promote, protect, and ensure the full and equal enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms by all persons with disabilities, and to promote respect for their inherent dignity, end quote. President Obama signed that UN Convention in 2009, and to this day, the US Senate has not ratified it. We are non-signatories to the treaty. Despite these other civil rights laws that are worthy of our attention, today I'm just going to focus primarily on the lead up to and passage of the ADA. And the passage of the ADA was important, and in part because much of the 20th century was still marked by forced institutionalization. Somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000, primarily women of color, were forcibly sterilized under the Buck v. Bell Supreme Court case that said the state can forcibly sterilize. Still to this day is standing Supreme Court law. It is still legal in a number of states to forcibly sterilize on the purpose of disability. 65% of children who are in correctional institutions have at least one disability, right? So like there's all, the history of the 20th century is not particularly pleasant, which is the reason why some of this is going to be needed. The ADA is often understood as the flagship civil rights protections for disabled individuals, and on the ADA website, it just says this is a federal civil rights law. Second disclaimer, even though the law is far from doing everything that we might, even though it's law, it is far from doing everything we might want for disability rights. There are significant criticisms of the ADA, including the fact that it largely leaves enforcement to individuals and city and state municipalities to get compliance. Usually the way that you get compliance is only if you file a complaint. I've done this to about 24 businesses in Grand Rapids. I've got the website. It's the Office of Civil Rights for the U.S. Federal Department of Justice, where you lobby, where you file ADA violations. Local businesses don't always like it when I point this out to them. Even if the law were stronger and had good enforcement, the mere existence of a law against discrimination, we all now know, doesn't do everything needed to transform the individuals in our communities that we're a part of. We are well aware of the continued of racist attitudes, for instance, despite the passage 60 years ago of the Civil Rights Act. Part of Mina's talk yesterday, for those of you who were here, was about the difference between desegregation and integration. And much of civil rights law aims at desegregation. And even if we achieve that, that doesn't mean that we yet have the full kind of community value and integration that we might ultimately want, right? But desegregation is better than segregate, right? It's a good first step. If you're interested, the two best books on this are Leonard Davis's Enabling Acts, which is primarily a history of the advocacy towards and passage of the ADA. Joseph Shapiro's No Pity, People with Disabilities, Forging a New Civil Rights Movement is much broader, is also a fantastic book. For those of you that aren't big on books but like films better, some of you might be familiar with Crip Camp that came out on Netflix a number of years ago. The whole film is available legally on YouTube, thanks in part to the Obamas. It's really about the connections between the disability rights movement and larger cultural issues like the sexual revolution and women's suffrage movement. I happen to, in terms of the disability rights and civil rights, prefer, it was the Boston NPR station put out Lives Worth Living, the fight for disability rights, but it's a lot harder to find. Both of those are well worth time watching. The disability rights movement in the United States doesn't have a clear beginning. Groups in Illinois and California began working in the early 1960s on ways for people with disabilities to live independently rather than in group homes or care facilities. It was spurred on then by the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Other legislation gave individuals with disabilities some legal protections. Medicaid and Medicare were established in 1965. The Architectural Barriers and Fair Housing Acts in 1968 had some protections for disabled people in federally funded housing. Title IX of the Education Amendments Act in 1972 also was part of this. Even though not all of this legislation was primarily about disability, but it did provide some degree of protection on the basis of civil rights. And those, like Title IX, that didn't specifically mention disability still became part of the motivation for the disability rights movement, trying to capture the larger cultural impetus that was starting to pick up some traction. As with both the Black Pride and Gay Pride movements, for which some of the early disability rights advocates drew their inspiration, people with disabilities sought to affirm their disabilities as part of their identities. The slogan for the disability rights movement in the United States is "Nothing about us without us." We get to talk about what our identities are, and we get to shape what the conversations are supposed to be. They realized that achieving equal rights would be difficult if the dominant cultural narrative was still that disability was always and only a bad thing. They wanted to change this narrative to affirm the value of their lives and their experiences. But they also realized that they would need to secure legal protections as part of the larger cultural movement. Hubert Humphrey, who had helped write the 1964 Civil Rights Act, actually began working on an amendment that would include disability as part of the Civil Rights Act of 1972. Politicians, though, including a number of leading African-American politicians, opposed the change. They were afraid that including disability in the Civil Rights Act would pollute the Civil Rights Act. And I should also mention here that the historic connections between racism and ableism are really, really deep. This was in the 1950s, I think it was, 1850s, 1860s. The head of the American Medical Association, in the Journal of the American Medical Association, argued that one reason that the emancipation of slaves was a bad idea was that the slaves were naturally disposed to becoming disabled. They couldn't handle freedom. And so slavery was actually an act of care towards blacks in America. In the Journal of the American Medical Association. And as I mentioned, the way in which it was primarily black and brown women that were the recipients of the forcible sterilization, right? All of these histories are very, very intertwined in all sorts of interesting but ugly ways. The Rehabilitation Act of 1973 aimed to shift federal assistance away from mere vocational rehabilitation towards independent living, right? We wanted to use the federal dollars that did go to disability not just to help folks prepare to have a vocation after being disabled or becoming disabled, but towards being able to live on their own, to push away from institutionalizations. Geraldo Rivera won the Pulitzer Prize for his expose of the Willowbrook institution on Staten Island in New York. One of the wings at Willowbrook had all of its patients, I think they were called, forcibly infected with hepatitis C to see what the spread of hepatitis looked like in a controlled population. And so the idea was that we need to not just prepare disabled individuals for jobs, but we need them to be able to live in a way that will affirm their dignity, affirm their autonomy. Prior to its passage, a staff member who to this day, to the best of my knowledge, nobody knows who this was. In between various drafts of the Rehabilitation Act, somebody just slid in a new section and nobody caught it very carefully and read it, and it was passed. And section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act says, no otherwise qualified handicapped individual in the United States, as defined in Section 7(6), shall solely by reason of his handicap be excluded from the participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subject to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. So this is the first time there is a federal civil right to only federally funded programs in the United States. The language here was intentionally modeled after the 1964 Civil Rights Act. It sought to extend certain legal rights and protections directly to disabled people for the first time in the U.S. history at the federal level. But it was only limited to, as the last clause here reads, programs receiving federal tax dollars. But it was a beginning, and this sort of, once it was passed, mobilized more and more disabled activists to try to push. So the disability justice movement took off in earnest when people began to then explicitly draw on successes from the civil rights movement and apply it to disability rights in the mid-70s. One reason for those involved in the movement to intentionally structure their own fight for civil rights after the racial civil rights movement is because of what they saw as the former's effectiveness. So here's a picture of Montgomery bus boycott. One of the first national organized disability rights campaigns was a Greyhound bus protest. This was led by a group called ADAPT, and for a long time it was puzzling to me, like, why of all the things that you might seek to sort of bring first national disability discrimination attention to is busing? Oh, because 10, 15 years ago, busing had been very, very central to the disability rights movement. They did sit-ins. Here is ADAPT a year into Trump's presidency, when Trump was trying to undermine the Affordable Care Act, which guarantees the right to insurance even on the basis of pre-existing condition. Disabled individuals went into Congress and had a sit-in in the Senate building for the sake of protesting what they saw as cuts to their programs. Despite individual successes, disability advocates saw the need to provide direct and all-encompassing protections from discrimination against those with disabilities. What they wanted is federal legislation that would give them the same kinds of civil rights protections as the Civil Rights Act. And in light of, again, Mina's talk yesterday, the "we shall overcome" language here on the picture should not be lost on us. The title slide had "Injustice Anywhere is a Threat to Justice Everywhere" from King. So in the mid-'80s, a number of legal cases started to narrow the protections of Section 504. Under the leadership of President Reagan, both the White House and Congress sought to limit disability-based protections. Reagan, in fact, wanted to weaken Section 504 in the Education for All Handicapped Children's Act as the first steps towards what he wanted to do in terms of undermining the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Right? So this is like his test cases. How much can I get away with in these cases of chipping away at legal protections? So it's kind of surprising then that his vice president, Bush Sr., would run, when Bush ran for president on the platform of compassionate conservatism, he actually, when he started using that phrase, didn't know what it meant. So he was looking around then to his advisors like, what would be a kind of law that I could campaign on that would show that I'm a compassionate conservative? And at the time, there was some actual legislation that had been being debated for a number of years that was co-sponsored by both a number of Republicans and a number of Democrats that would become the ADA. And so Bush used this as part of the flagship for his compassionate conservatism that got him elected in 1988. The ADA was signed into law then in 1990. It was called the most significant civil rights legislation in 30 years. Both disability activist Judy Heumann and Senator Ted Kennedy referred to the passing of the ADA as the Emancipation Proclamation for individuals with disabilities. Again, drawing on the history of emancipation and civil rights for race in this country. The ADA, when it was finally brought to a vote after about 4 years, was passed with overwhelming support despite opposition to other civil rights legislation that Bush's White House would bring forward. When signing the law into action, when signing the act into law, President Bush's public comments included the following. So this is going to be a fairly big chunk of text here. This is Bush. At the time, it was the largest public signing in the Rose Garden of any federal legislation. With today's signing of the landmark Americans with Disabilities Act, every man, woman, and child with a disability can now pass through once closed doors into a bright new era of equality, independence, and freedom. As I look around at these joyous faces, I remember clearly how many years of dedicated commitment have gone into making this historic new Civil Rights Act a reality. This historic act is the world's first comprehensive declaration of equality for people with disabilities. It will ensure that people with disabilities are given the basic guarantees for which we have worked so hard and so long: independence, freedom of choice, control of their lives, the opportunity to blend fully and equally into the rich mosaic of the American mainstream. Legally, it will provide our disabled community with a powerful expansion of protections and then basic civil rights. It will guarantee fair and just access to the fruits of American life, which we must all be able to enjoy. At the end of his speech, he compared the passage of the ADA with the fall of the Berlin Wall the year before. He said, "We rejoice as this barrier falls, proclaiming together, we will not accept, we will not excuse, we will not tolerate discrimination in America." Minor aside, if only. On your behalf, as well as the behalf of this entire country, I now lift my pen to sign this Americans with Disabilities Act, and I say, let the shameful wall of exclusion finally come tumbling down, and everybody lived happily ever after, except that they didn't. The law as a whole was intended to provide a clear and comprehensive national mandate for the elimination of discrimination on the basis of disability, in part because of the long history of isolation, segregation, discrimination that disabled people had faced. With the passage of the ADA, public accommodations could no longer legally discriminate on the basis of disability. You couldn't be denied entrance into a theater because you're a wheelchair user. Telephones had to start working on ways in which you could do text over telephone, which is now super useful for all of us that have cell phones. The speech-to-text and text-to-speech technology came out of the ADA. Subtitles came out of this. Nevertheless, the ADA was not entirely successful. As mentioned earlier, compliance with the law is incomplete, and enforcement of the ADA is primarily left to individuals who are willing to file cases. There have been over 10,000 federal ADA lawsuits under Title III, and almost every year since 2018, it dropped down under 10,000 in 2022. The data on 2023 is not quite out yet. It's also worth noting that the protections secured for disabled individuals by the ADA were sufficiently restricted by a series of court and Supreme Court cases, such that in 2008, the ADA Amendments Act was passed to redress some of those issues, right? The courts had sort of narrow what was allowed to be claimed as a disability, and so an amendment was needed to sort of push the barriers back. The ADA has been called the most groundbreaking piece of American civil rights legislation since the Civil Rights Act. And it's been a great step. Yet there are segments of American life where the basic guarantees and civil rights protections that Bush enumerated in the signing ceremony simply do not apply. There are places where significant portions of that shameful wall that he talked about of structural exclusion still stand. It was clear during the bill's drafting that both the Bush White House and Republican senators wanted religious organizations to be exempt from whatever final form of legislation it would take, including Title I, which is the part of the ADA which is about employment. And so the Bob Dole archive has a great set of PDFs that you can access where you've got all this advocacy language coming from various kinds of religious groups saying we should be exempt for various reasons. The National Association of Evangelicals lobbied on behalf of a number of denominations, including the CRC, which is the denomination that Calvin, my university, is a part of, to be exempt. Republicans claimed that the ADA would impose extensive requirements on religious organizations. There's no indications that they wrote that religious organizations actually discriminate against Americans with disabilities. And whoever wrote that was just either lying or completely ignorant. I suspect the former. William Bentley Ball, a lawyer representing the Association of Christian Schools International and other religious entities, he would later go on to represent the Amish families in Wisconsin v. Yoder. Those of you that know your religious history cases, raised a number of concerns to the White House about the developing legislation. From the start, the exemption for religious institutions was framed in terms of religious liberty and avoiding religious entanglement. Religious exercise within the meaning of the First Amendment, they claim, will be directly involved if churches and religious schools are not expressly exempted from the terms of the ADA. Ball argued in one of these letters that you can now find, for instance, that if religious schools were not exempt from the ADA, being HIV positive was a disability. And so then churches and religious schools couldn't fire HIV positive AIDS clergy, and then they could be forced to have gay clergy. So this is rooted in this idea of we need to be able to fire folks for being queer. A Christian school, he wrote, is morally required as a matter of clear and unconditional religious principle to discriminate against carriers of AIDS where AIDS was incurred through immoral conduct, end quote. I suspect he's not actually all that interested in figuring out how it was actually acquired, but just using that as the pretense to blame the individuals who were HIV positive for their own medical condition because they're just, right? It's almost as if we have a long history. Sometimes I get a little snarky. It's almost as if in this country we have a long history of, right, blaming oppression on the oppressed people. This is the late 80s. HIV was almost unanimously seen in the United States as a gay disease. And at the time, American Christianity this is the rise of the religious right? This idea that American religion, in terms of especially evangelical Christianity, is somehow at threat, and we have to reassert our ability to be there. Ball also argued for the exemption on the basis of financial costs, but of course businesses nationwide had opposed the ADA on the basis of financial costs, and it wasn't allowed to slide there. In his letter to the White House Office of Policy Development, making the claim for the religious exemption, Ball argued that there is not a compelling state interest in preventing religious institutions from engaging in disability discrimination. He wrote, and here I quote, "Nothing can be clearer that the free exercise of religion will be seriously impaired by imposing the ADA on religious bodies. Nothing has been shown to indicate that there is a national necessity to apply the ADA bill to churches, religious schools, and other ministries. That absence of evidence in itself indicates that religious organizations are, by and large, within their means and in keeping with their compassionate traditions, acting to protect and accommodate persons with disabilities. And again, that's either just complete ignorance or willful obfuscation for the case of political gain. And these efforts were largely successful. Churches and other religious organizations are granted complete exemption from Title III of the ADA, which deals with access to programming and spaces and public accommodations. As a result of this exemption, all their facilities, programs, and activities, whether or not they're religious in nature, are exempt. Super interesting to me that so many churches are actually used as polling places in the United States when churches are exempt from the ADA. That's interesting to think about. Internal documents from the Bush administration make it clear that religious organizations also sought a full exemption from Title I of the ADA, which is the part that deals with employment. Here they weren't as successful as religious organizations that have at least 15 employees are in fact covered by Title I of the ADA. So if you've got at least 15 employees at your church or your Christian school, then you can't legally discriminate on the basis of disability, except by a backdoor that I'll talk about here in a minute. If the job is claimed by the religious institution to involve the ministerial functions, it's covered by the ministerial exception. And there's been a series of cases over the past 35 years where what gets counted as the ministerial exception has just increased and increased. There's a teacher of, I think it was mathematics at a Catholic school who didn't teach any religious classes, wasn't involved with chapel. She was like a teacher. Sounds horrible to put it this way. She was just a math teacher. I love math teachers, right? Like she was not involved in religious education whatsoever. She got cancer. The school's insurance rates were going to go up. So they fired her. She sued under the EEOC and ADA compliance. And the school said, well, you're part of teaching at our religious school, so you're considered a minister for the sake of what we do. And so she fell under the ministerial exception, and she was allowed to be fired. So religious institutions, if they claim that their staff or their faculty, their employees are fulfilling religious tasks of the religious institution, even if they're not specifically religious tasks, fall under the ADA, fall under the religious exemption. This is why it is so hard for faculty of color to sue for racial discrimination at private schools, because there's also a long history of religious institutions, colleges, university, claiming that all of their faculty fall under the ministerial exception, and so thus are immune from racial non-discrimination cases, too. Since religious schools are afforded the same freedom of religion as are churches, synagogues, mosques, and other houses of worship, the religious exemption also includes religious schools, K-12, college, university, to provide access to disabled students. So, if you're going to a religious private institution and are known to be disabled, they can legally deny you access. Technically, my university has to provide no disability accommodations to any disabled students under the same sort of law. We do. We're not great at it, but we do provide it. Now, it's important to keep in mind that religious freedom through much of U.S. history has been claimed very selectively and in ways that often track racial understandings of the time. Right? So think of either the folks that were brought over in the transatlantic slave trade or their descendants trying to claim religious freedom for some of their religious beliefs. Right? We didn't extend religious freedom protections to them. For part of our nation's history, it was largely not extended to Catholics, Muslims, Jews. Claims of religious freedom were actually used, in fact, by parts of the U.S. federal government to defend the institution of slavery and racial discrimination. These facts show that the role of religious freedom in the U.S. is shaped by the larger cultural ideologies and the biases against some social groups that are parts of those ideologies. Opposition to civil rights legislation on the basis of religious freedom is not unique to debates about the ADA. In some of these other contexts, the courts have established limitations on religious freedom when it comes to other forms of discrimination. So somebody earlier today mentioned the Lovering v. Virginia case that was finally decided to, at the federal level, permit interracial marriage. Bob Jones University had a history of prohibiting interracial dating on the claim of religious freedom. And when their case went up through the Supreme Court, Bob Jones University is still allowed to kick out students for interracial dating. But if they do that, then they will lose their tax-exempt status. And so, right, there's this indirect protection because universities like their tax-exempt status. So, right, this is not unique to disability. There's parallels with race and gender, parallels these days with sexual orientation and trans issues. There have been other kinds of limitations to religious freedom. Your church still has to have fire alarms, for instance, right? There are various kinds of ways that the limitations for religious freedom have been constrained. But it is still possible for a school to either deny access to or enrollment to a disabled individual simply on the basis of their disability status. If they claim that you're an employee who fulfills ministerial functions, they can fire you for disability degree status. So race is held to they're held to strict scrutiny. And so the federal government has a more active interest in preventing racial discrimination from institutions that receive indirect federal assistance like tax-exempt status than it does for other kinds of discrimination. So in this third and final section then, maybe we should think that like this is a problem. Hope you think this is a problem. I think this is a problem. I'm not going to argue right now if this is a problem. Suppose that you agree, well, like this history is a problem. What do we do about it? How do we think about it? In this third and final section, I want to canvass a number of civic virtues that might help us push back against the kind of disability discrimination that is still legal in the country. And so much of what I'm going to say here is I don't think is unique to the particular context. I think that some of these same virtues have come up in the last few days talking about the racial civil rights movement that come with all kinds of other ways in which our culture wants to devalue other marginalized folks. So I don't think there's anything unique here about the disability case. These same virtues might help us destabilize many of the ableist attitudes, perceptions that make it hard for disabled people, even in the absence of the legality of explicit discrimination. I'm Christian. And as we know from the racial civil rights movement, it's not as if American Christianity has a great track record about racial civil rights. But as I understand Christianity, it's essentially about liberation from oppression, not continuing it. Right? I think that there should be I think in the same way that many of the leaders of the racial civil rights movement were religious clergy, it would be wonderful if the leaders of the disability rights movement were also clergy. And to the best of my knowledge, very few. Many of them were actually culturally Jewish. Judy Heumann was, for instance, she talks about it in her biography. But it'd be nice, for those of us that self-identify as Christians, wouldn't it be nice if the church was at the forefront of liberation movements? Okay. And I actually think that probably any virtue that you talk about could have a role in this case, right? But I've got 4 minutes left. I'm not going to try to talk about all of them. The other thing to mention real quick is sometimes it's not actually the virtue, but the actions that the virtuous person would do that are going to be helpful, right? And so in the virtue tradition, you can not be virtuous, but do what the virtuous person would do. This is actually part of what Michael Lamb talked about yesterday as habituation. You want to become just, keep doing what the just person would do until you internalize the motivation so that you do the right thing at the right time, to the right degree, for the right reason, in the right context. You might have politicians of any sort of level that support civil rights laws, not because they're actually motivated by right reason, but for re-election purposes, right? But in that sense, it's them doing the actions that the virtuous person would do that might be the steps towards getting the civil rights protections. But we're going to be a lot more stable as a society if the reason why we make these changes is rooted in something about our individual and collective character. Because if it's just rooted in self-interest for re-election, then as soon as the political winds change, right, then you're not going to get those same kinds of protections. So 2 disclaimers there. Okay. First virtue. I love it when I can work in a Metallica slide into PowerPoint here. Justice is obviously going to be connected here. We might think of justice historically understood as rendering to everyone what is their due, in the same way that you should not be denied opportunities for certain kind of employment or living in certain neighborhoods or various kinds of access to public buildings simply on the basis of race. We might think that you shouldn't be denied that simply on the basis of disability. And the other thing that's nice about justice is an inherently communal or civic or social virtue. The phrasing social justice gets politically tricky these days. There's no justice of just the individual, right? Merely individual justice makes no sense because justice is giving others what they're due. I've got some students sometimes that don't like it when I talk about social justice. And I'm like, okay, what part of justice that's not social in nature would you prefer that we talk about? And they go away sorrowful. What is due to another person, this idea of giving to people what they are due, is actually where the language of a right comes from. Civil rights are what are due to somebody simply in virtue of their being a member of your civil community. Human rights are kinds of treatment that are due or prohibitions of certain other kinds of treatment that are due to other people simply on the basis of their being human. So justice is going to be central. But justice is hard. Many of our civic disagreements are not between people who care about justice and those who are fine with injustice. Rather, our civic disagreements are very often between people with competing views of what justice requires. We can't properly orient to the good if we don't know what the good is. And there are a whole host of virtues called epistemic or intellectual virtues that can orient us to the needed knowledge. Skip that one. Getting a little behind here, so I'm skipping over some stuff. Nate King, who teaches at Whitworth, I believe, has this excellent book, teaches beautifully about the nature of intellectual virtues for everyday life. To take 2 of the intellectual virtues he examines, consider intellectual open-mindedness and humility. King describes intellectual open-mindedness as being willing and able to transcend our default perspective on an issue, to take seriously the merits of alternate views. My guess is that prior to 42 minutes ago, many of you didn't know some of this history. Most of I teach a class called Disability, Community, and Advocacy. And every time I teach it, students are like, why did I know something about the civil rights movement, something about the women's liberation movement, and I've never heard any of this history? It's because culturally we're a lot more willing to accept explicit ableism than we are do racism. And we still are willing to tolerate lots of explicit and a whole lot of implicit racism. You can't figure out this if you're not willing to learn new things. Intellectual open-mindedness is the recognition of the limitations of the relevant knowledge that you already have, and the willingness not just to hear, but internalize, take, and then act on the kind of information that you learn. But then who should we learn from? Hey, maybe I need to learn something. Where do I turn? Here I think it's beneficial to learn from what philosophers and some other academics called standpoint theory, the idea that our social location systematically shapes and limits what we know. Social location should be understood in relation to not just individuals' epistemic locations, but larger structural forces and conditions. Does double consciousness come from Du Bois? Yeah. So this idea that if you are a African American in antebellum South, right, you've got to understand not just black culture, but white culture in order to learn how to function. So it was black folks that actually understood more than the white folks that they were having to live in the dominant ideology of. Once we realize and take standpoint into account, we realize that often the epistemic tables are turned. It's those who are economically dispossessed, politically oppressed, socially marginalized, are likely to have the very same people that our culture often wants to sort of denigrate as knowers, often have the better perspective. Whenever parents come to me, I found out that my child is autistic, where do I turn? I direct them to TikTok. Go find autistic adults on TikTok. Because if you don't know any autistic adults, you're going to need to learn from people that have learned for 20, 30, 40, 50 years what your child is going to be experiencing for the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Learn from the people who have lived it. Those of us who aren't disabled need to not only learn humbly from those who do know better, but we then need to be in solidarity with them. I teach our philosophy of gender class. I am white, male, straight, cis, highly educated, middle class, Christian, like any kind of cultural privilege there is, like it's me. And I teach the field of gender class. And part of what I think I'm committed to is being in solidarity with women, females, queer folks, trans folks, people of color, disabled people, because even though they know better what it's like to be in their situation, I have all sorts of privilege that they don't have, and I think justice requires me to leverage for their good. Lee Hunt Hendricks and Astra Taylor have this wonderful new book on solidarity that just came out a couple of months ago. Solidarity involves taking a side against people who discriminate, pollute, exploit, profiteer. So we need justice, we need intellectual humility, we need solidarity. They actually, in unpacking this at the end of the book, list specific virtues that they think solidarity requires. They list justice, I've already mentioned that one, hospitality. Aaron, you've done some work on hospitality. This is super interesting to think about. Courage, humility, curiosity, perseverance. Some of these I know are some of the 5 virtues that are built into this. I want to say that one of the ones that's not, I'm just going to mention 2 more real quick because I'm over time here. Part of it is compassion, literally suffering with. Part of solidarity is being willing to go into those hard spaces with the people that have been in those hard spaces so that they know that they are not alone. Because especially if civil rights movements are inherently political, hard, long-term struggles, they need to know that those of us that are privileged and recognize their struggles are there willing to help. We need to get off our keisters. Finally, I mentioned this in a response earlier, anger. Anger came up a number of times before. Maisha Cherry's The Case for Rage is a lovely book. Draws largely off of King and Audre Lorde, The Uses of Anger essay that Lorde wrote. Fantastic book, highly recommend this. Anger is often directed at where we think injustice is, and anger is often a reflection of what we love. We get angry when those people that we love are harmed in ways we think that they don't deserve. And so there are all kinds of ways for anger to go bad, but sometimes if we're not angry, right, it reflects that we're just willing to tolerate the status quo where this sort of stuff, this sort of injustice, the kinds of oppression that we've been talking about and experiencing and learning the history of the last few days are willing to do. And so, and I'll be honest, I don't know how to live in these kinds of spaces. in anger without it being bad for me. I help a number of families with disability advocacy, and whenever I leave their meetings, I am just so mad because family after family experiences this. And then I go for long drives before I go home so I don't misdirect my anger at social systems, at my wife or children. But it's bad for my health, it's bad for my mental health, it's bad for my, right? It's just, so what it's like, this is one of the things I don't understand. How can you engage in some of this action for years, decades? I think this connects with your talk earlier, Dan. How do we live in those places in disappointment and frustration without the anger just consuming us? I wish I knew, but I don't. But I'm also out of time. So, thank you.
I have a microphone, but I would love to give space for other people to ask questions. So I will look for a hand. Yes.
So other folks have been answering questions from down there. Is there a reason to do? I mean, not that I want to lord over my position, but it's easier for me to see.
The other folks didn't have a
Okay, okay.
So that's
Okay.
So first of all, I just want to say thank you for that talk. It was incredibly interesting. And I'm sure I speak for a lot of people in the room. I did not know that much about the history of the ADA, and particularly that relationship with religious exemption. That is fascinating and horrifying at the same time. Yep. I wonder if you could comment on the ways in which you see this still persisting in the current environment, and how we, especially in a Trump world where, you know, he's not in office right now, but we have a very scary chance that he will be in office again. So how do you see that playing out?
Yeah, and so many of the histories, as I mentioned early on, right, the ableist history closely connected with racist, right, aspects. Immigration is one of these places. So part of Trump's immigration platform that he not only sought to enact during his first term, but is also still part of his campaign, is to prevent folks entering into the country that might draw more resources than they'll contribute in tax dollars. Now, of course, I don't think that he's equally worried about immigrants from Canada as he is from Mexico. Can't imagine what that reason would be. Oh yes, I can. Right, but the ways in which immigration is connected with racism in our country and the use of disability as a proxy for these other kinds of, right, and religion also functions here as well with the immigration ban from predominantly Muslim countries early on in his. So all of these are closely intertwined. Jennifer, so I make lots of book recommendations. Jennifer Saul, who's a political philosopher, has got a great new book called Dog Whistles and Fig Leaves. And a dog whistle is coded or semi-coded language where the people know what we're really talking about, but we don't have to talk about it. Tough on crime. Right? High crime neighborhood is largely a dog whistle for black and brown neighborhoods. And a fig leaf is a way in which we try to cover up sort of like the racism behind our comments with, like, right, a statue's fig leaf that covers the genitalia. Right? Well, I've heard other people say, right? And so Saul's book has great discussions of how disability, race, crime, all these issues are often just dog whistles for what's really going on. And so there are all sorts of connections, right? And the other thing to say here is that the way in which disability is disproportionately disadvantageous to people of color in the United States. And so there is a much higher likelihood that black school children in the US will be diagnosed as intellectually disabled rather than autistic. And so, right, in the same way that our prison system and the school-to-prison pipeline is deeply, deeply racist, the way that the legal protections for disability get used in all sorts of racist, right, ways, even though they're not supposed to, is super deep. So, I mean, we see this all the time. I mean, I actually started thinking about these because our son was kicked out of his Christian school after 7 years because they just said, we're no longer interested in accommodating his disabilities. Crap, right? And I write on justice, and I'd been writing on disability, and so there might actually be legal strategies going forward that we might be able to start addressing these sorts of issues. So this is something that is faced by lots of folks, and lots of folks that are otherwise, right, privileged in all sorts of ways. So there's an initial answer to your question.
I appreciate, obviously, the parallels between civil rights based on race and disabilities and LGBTQ and so on. And one of the last things I think I understood you to say is that race is often held at a level higher as far as allowing religious organizations to discriminate. And I've been very puzzled about this as to why, after, Loving, that like Oral Roberts and some of these universities did decide they would allow interracial couples, but because they didn't want to lose their tax status. But that doesn't seem to be coming up around, LGBT folks. Yep. Or around disabilities. And so why is it we as a country are allowing that difference?
I mean, the short, cheeky, but true answer is we're problematic and not super interested, right? I mean, like, the collective we often aren't super interested. But it was only through a number of court cases, and I think that the Bob Jones case only got decided at the federal level because a number of cases had gone up that far. And a lot of the competing cases that are similar with respect to sexual identity or sexual orientation, identity, disability status haven't tracked their way up to the Supreme Court level yet. And so there's not any law that officially says disability is going to be held down to this level. But there is a Supreme Court decision that says because we care so much, it's so important for our body politic to engage the history of racism here, we're going to, right, in order to continue to legally discriminate on the basis of race, you've got to show, right, this very high standard. And so race got elevated to strict scrutiny. There's nothing that says disability couldn't be, but it's just the way that this has not yet worked fully through the Supreme Court system. And because lots of our, right, so in order to get the law changed, you either have to challenge the law to the Supreme Court or you get the legislators to change it. And there's just in the past, 20 years, there hasn't been the collective will to try and do this, right? Because American politics is messed up in all sorts of ways. So it's basically because the only way to do this is to have a Supreme Court decision that goes that way, or for Congress to, right, pass a law that then gets signed into law by the president that would elevate the kind of scrutiny that disability discrimination has to meet.
My mom was diagnosed with MS in 1987, and she didn't tell anybody. I didn't even know until 1994, because the only reason she told was because she was afraid that people would think she was an alcoholic because she was stumbling. She was more embarrassed of being called an alcoholic before coming out of the closet, she said, of having MS, because it was such a stigma to be disabled. That never stopped until she died. People still stared at her. It was very hard for me, but more for my daughter, that would lash out at people of why they were still staring at her, that my mom didn't want to go places at certain points, up until she died, until 2023. 2021, when she passed away. The stigma hasn't gone away. They stared. Mm-hmm. And it never went away for her. So what do you think? I mean, it didn't matter what race anybody was, they were still staring at my mother.
Yeah, so a couple things to say here. First is that we stigmatize different disabilities in different ways, right? And so, right, stumbling that might be seen as being alcoholic is going to be seen different than somebody who's a war veteran and an amputee. So like the history of prosthetics in the US is super interesting. After the Civil War, right, tons and tons of folks that lost arms or legs. And so shortly after the Civil War, a lot of both Union and Confederate soldiers would just pin their pant leg if they lost a leg and use crutches, right? Because their disability was seen as in service of their country or the Confederacy, right? It was positive. And you didn't really get the same kind of hiding physical disability into the late 1800s, into the 1900s with the passage of the Ugly Laws. My wife's dad lost a leg in Korea, stepped on a landmine, was an amputee from just below his knee his entire life. And he passed away a little over a year ago, and we've got about 7 or 8 of his prosthetic legs that we now have he lived with us for 7 years. And for a long time then, prosthetic legs were meant to look as much like normal legs as possible. And largely since Afghanistan and all the new amputations that are required because of our activities there, the technology for prosthetic arms and legs has come a long way. And now you see lots and lots of folks, right, wearing new prosthetics that don't look to be as similar to, right, and so you've got folks that wear the carbon fiber running legs that curve backwards and all kinds of stuff. My father-in-law, when he got his new semi-looking bionic leg that was, right, modeled on these technologies, when he would go out in public, if his leg was not visible and he was using a wheelchair and he did not have on his veteran's hat, we go to a restaurant, everybody would ask whoever was pushing the wheelchair, how many people, right? Like, he was seen as a non-agent. But if he went out in his Korea vet hat and his leg was visible, he would literally sometimes in the course of a couple of hours have a dozen people come up and thank him for his service, right? So we stigmatize different disabilities in all sorts of ways. And I do think that we are slowly getting better on some of them. The way in which elementary, middle, high school, and even a lot of our college students, right? Autism is not stigmatized nearly to the degree that it used to be. Now it's still pretty stigmatized, but it's coming. But intellectual disability is stigmatized, right, in various ways. So it's, right, you can say that it's still a problem and say it's gotten better, with also having to admit that it hasn't gotten better in equal sorts of ways. But it is one of these places where the current trajectory is way too slow, but largely in good directions. But as we know, here's a place where I think King's language is a little misguided, right? The arc of history is long and bends towards justice, unless it doesn't, right? And then sometimes things get worse. And so it's just not clear that the kinds of progress that we've made either on racial or disability or sex, gender, sexual orientation issues are going to, right, stay where they're at. So I do think that we've gotten better inconsistently, but as one reason I think we need to have better policies, better laws, better protections is because we don't want to be holden to what the current cultural zeitgeist is in a way that legal protections get us something a little bit more firm.
So this is I want to ask a question right on this point. So I know that I'm the director of a program that's about civil rights and civic virtue, and you ended your talk thinking about civic virtues, but I want to push back and say maybe that's the wrong place for this reason. There's a quote, I don't remember it, but it's basically something in the civil rights history. It was if we wait for the white supremacist conscience to be pricked, such that they change their attitude, nothing will ever happen. I don't care about their conscience. What I care about is their actions. And in order to change those, we need legal protections. And so we asked you to talk about civic virtues, but some of your talk says, like, that's really not that important at this point, right? What's really important is we need to change the structures in such a way that whether or not people respond virtuously, those who are victims of injustice are no longer victimized. So that's not really a question, it's a comment, but there's a kind of a question buried there. So
what do you think about that, to use Eleanor's language?
there you go, perfect.
Yeah, I mean, if we really collectively had the civic virtues, we might not need, right, the civil rights protections, the legal protections. But we don't. And educating people out of various sorts of collective, communal, civic vice is really hard. And so I think we actually need a two-pronged strategy. Right? We need to get, I mean, not the, the ADA was like in development for over a decade. And it's not like legal protections are quick. Right? But in some ways, they're quicker than cultural change. Again, you see something similar with the civil rights movement. But you only get those civil rights protections when you've got a subpart of the community that does have those virtues and does engage in the kind of long-term collective action, right? So in the last few days, it's not as if we think that the various kinds of virtues that the leaders of the civil rights movement had were non-contributory to the to the Civil Rights Acts or the ways in which we've. So the virtues can be helpful for as the subpart of the community to get the legal protections, but then we also just have to transform the broader body politic. I mean, it would be great if we were at a place in US history where we didn't need the Civil Rights Act, but we're nowhere close to that. Right? In part because the individual, the structure, I mean, it's not as if the Civil Rights Act suddenly got rid of structural racism with regard to, right, the mortgage exemption and the history of redlining and all this kind of stuff, right? So it's going to take, even after we get certain kinds of protections, a long time for the larger structures to catch up. But we need both. If we had this civic transformation, the communal transformation, maybe we wouldn't need the other thing, right? But like, that's like roughly to ask what sort of political orientation would we need to have if we had just morally perfect people? In a sense, it really wouldn't matter at that point, right? Because you've got the virtue. So there are differences between the civil rights protections and the various kinds of virtues that I've been talking about. But often the virtues are needed to help get those kinds of protections. And especially for those of us, again, like me, that are the privileged folk, to learn from the folks that have experienced and continue to experience this, and then to leverage whatever kind of privilege we have to try and increase the virtue of those around us and increase the protections so that the burden isn't disproportionately borne by those who, right, or the recipient. One of my favorite pictures of the civil rights movement is a picture of Father Hesburgh linked arm in arm with Martin Luther King. Father Hesburgh is a Catholic priest, white Catholic priest. He is who the Hesburgh Library, better known as Touchdown Jesus, is named after at Notre Dame. You have a white Catholic priest on the front lines of the civil rights movement. Love that, right? That was him leveraging his privilege and position for the benefit of people that he knew his common good was connected with that might not have been seen. And so I think we need to do something similar here, right? So even though I did argue for some kind of standpoint theory with respect to who's most likely to understand what the kinds of needs of marginalized folks are. Those of us that then do learn from that can try and I think justice requires us to try to leverage our position for the benefit of people in our communities. So it's a messy relationship, but I think that most things morally are messy.
So I just wanted to ask, as we talk of religious freedom, so do you think that the Louisiana bill requiring the 10 Commandments to be displayed in public schools is a direct threat to religious freedom?
Depends whose religious freedom you ask, right? To the best of my knowledge, it is not Jewish legislators that are pushing for the 10 Commandments, even though the 10 Commandments are in the Old Testament. Right, it's primarily self-identified Christians that are pushing for it. And if you asked for the same kind of protection for parts of the Quran or the Gita, right, you're not going to get it. Like, it should not be surprising to any of us that it is Christians pushing for, right, specifically the Ten Commandments in this kind of way. What would be a lot more interesting if they were pushing for, like, the Beatitudes, maybe? Blessed are the peacemakers. Maybe that would be a good one to have in our classroom. So the history of religious freedom, as I mentioned, in the US has largely been protections for largely white Protestant Christians in US history. And so I think that the Louisiana bill is still reflective of that, right? I think that it should not be a surprising fact that this is coming from a push from a southern state by almost exclusively white, self-identified Protestant Christian folks. In some ways, I think it functions analogously to how some of the Confederate general statutes functioned culture. It isn't a perfect parallel, right? But it is a way of carving out, this is and always has been our space, and those of you that don't fit are suspect. And I think it is precisely, right, some of the same folks that have concerns about immigration that are pushing for this, because we want Muslim children to feel uncomfortable in our schools. So despite liking the Ten Commandments, this is incredibly biased. And I think that the bias is part of what's motivating it.
All right, so I think this will be the last question. And then for those of you who have additional questions, Kevin's around and you can ask him some more.
Several years ago, Alabama went through this issue about the Ten Commandments when the monument was put in the Alabama Supreme Court. That Chief Justice resigned. Let me say that the head of the, now late head of the Alabama Teachers Association pushed for character education to become the law. So the principles would be taught that are underwritten by the Ten Commandments without doing it in a religious way. Let me say that while listening to you, I have been thinking about our Montgomery District Attorney who was on the news the other night, talking again about 200 murder cases that have not gone to trial in this historic community because they don't have enough judges to try them. And I think that it's important to respect both sides of those who are respecting the principles that the Ten Commandments are based on. And I would like for you to comment, please.
I'm not sure I'm going to fully be able to, I'm not quite sure what kind of comment that you are looking for here. I mean, I would love if we had more judges, right, and more district attorneys and more public defenders so that we could work out some of the backlog of our court system, in part because our court system, like much of our legal system, operates in structurally racist ways that disproportionately disadvantage people of color in the United States. So I would support there being more judges and district attorneys and public defenders to clear out some of that backlog. It's not clear to me how the Ten Commandments necessarily function in that kind of way to do that. And I don't know about the history of the Ten Commandments here in Alabama in sort of this kind of way. Whenever I hear folks arguing for, this was in Oklahoma, right? The the Oklahoma Capitol building, I think it was, had a Ten Commandment statue, and it was struck down as violating the separation of church and state because it was appealing to one religious tradition rather than another. And so then it was given back to the family that had donated it and or had sculpted it or something. And then they donated it to be displayed on public land, but not as a public statue. And then the Church of Satan donated what to me is I would actually love to hear your thoughts about this statue in virtue of your talk about aesthetics. Let me see if I can pull it up real quick. And I promise this really is me trying to in part answer your question. This is what I often do in my classroom. images. Yes. Fascinating statue. So if you're saying that religious freedom, right, the state, by displaying a donated monument, is not endorsing it, then if the state is going to do that for a Christian or Judeo-Christian statue like the Ten Commandments in order to not disproportionately favor Christianity, they also need to display this one. And I say that as somebody who is, in fact, not a Satanist. I don't think I've ever uttered those words in public before. They are captured on the recording. On Monday night, I gave a different talk where I had to say on record that I was not endorsing assassination. It's been an interesting week. So again, as a Christian, I think that given the way in which religious liberty should function in our country, if you're going to display on public ground the Ten Commandments, you should also be willing to display this. You don't get to privilege your own religious tradition at the expense of somebody else's. And if that, I mean, there's two ways to go with that. Either we have lots of space for lots of statues. I suspect that's not going to happen. Then we shouldn't display, right? And again, that's not to say that I'm against the Ten Commandments. It just said the way that the First Amendment is written is the U.S. government is not supposed to privilege one, this is the institution clause of the, not supposed to favor one religious tradition over another. And you had similar debates in the 80s about prayer in school, early 90s. Right? Where I remember my own high school graduation, we actually had somebody pray at. Interesting to think about what sort of person from what sort of religious traditions would be allowed to pray at a public high school. And so even though I think that one religion is one that I identify with, I don't think that it should be privileged over others, in part because of the way that the First Amendment in our country should in fact function. So I'm for certain kinds of religious freedoms, but religious freedoms always, I think, are going to have limitations in the same way that freedom of speech and freedom of assembly also have limitations. And if we're going to have the limits, they need to be provided in an equitable and just way to members of different religious traditions, or else it's going to function as a kind of bigotry hiding behind something else in a way that, right, lots of this has functioned. And to connect with the first question, Trump's immigration policy was. So, yay Ten Commandments, yay cool statues. Maybe we shouldn't have all cool statues on courthouse lawns in Oklahoma. And I don't know enough about Alabama's current school system to comment on the Ten Commandments in Alabama schools.
I think this is a very interesting point at which to end the talk. I'm so grateful that we have Kevin on camera saying those things. So please join me one last time in thanking Dr. Kevin Timpe.